Hi, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Miller, HOK's Director of Public Relations, and thank you for joining us for what is sure to be a lively conversation about artificial intelligence and its impact on the architecture profession. I'm joined by three panelists today who explore this topic on a daily basis. Humbi Song is an assistant professor and emerging architect fellow at the University of Toronto, where her work focuses on the intersection of architecture, technology, and the human computer interaction. Paul Harrison is the design principal for HOK's Canadian practice. He too serves as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where he teaches a design studio and lectures on design and computation. And then our third guest, Loren Supp, is the design principal in HOK's Seattle studio, and he also co-chairs our design board. Loren is also an active member of HOK's AI Working Group, and that's a group that examines how new generative AI technology can enhance project delivery. So we welcome those of you who are watching us live to put comments and questions in the LinkedIn comment section, and we will do our best to respond to those and engage those and weave them into the conversation. But let's dive in. There is a lot that we're going to try and tackle in about 30 minutes. So I'm going to begin with a question for all three of you. What excites you most about AI's potential in design, and what keeps you up at night? Who wants to take it?
All right. I guess I'll start it off, and I know that Paul and Ambi will fill it in pretty fast. So I'll start with what excites me about it. What excites me about AI is um, it really is like getting an extra set of hands. I mean, and really, when I start to think about the power of AI, it's at the generative end. It's the how do we start to create quicker and how to create more ideas that we can start to iterate off of and explore. And I think that that's really, I mean, even in the early days of AI in architecture, if you will, we're seeing how powerful that can be as we start to, both on a three-dimensional modeling, visualization, coding, and all of those buckets, we're able to see things move extremely quickly to kind of solve a little bit of the blank sheet of paper problem that we often confront. So that to me, and I'll just kind of start it with there. Maybe I'll let one of the other panelists kind of hop in and start to fill it in more from there.
Sure. I think I want to echo what he's saying about the the supercharging or having an extra pair of hands. And I think what's been very exciting for me is how people have been very ingenious in terms of thinking of all the different ways they can integrate AI, like both generative AI and non-generative, like more machine learning models into the process of design. And seeing that range of possibilities has been very exciting, like beyond just, let's say, like the initial 2D image making. So for instance, like tool development has been especially exciting to me because it starts to get at the idea of the designer sort of being very intentional about designing their own process or designing their own tools, and also forces people to start thinking about the softwares that we're already using on a daily basis, like Rhino or AutoCAD, or let's say even Blender. You know, they have encoded in themselves in the software itself some assumptions about the way you're supposed to design. And so by people using AI being forced to confront this question, they're also confronting this as they're just engaging in their more typical workflows. And I think that has been a really productive conversation. But I will also talk about what keeps me up at night, which is that I think that it can be pretty problematic to have, like, I think that current UI interface for a lot of these generative AI tools is very one click, like get out the solution. And because they're getting faster, more efficient, and more fully realistic, it's been getting a little bit like um, you're confronted with these options and very difficult for the designer to put in their own like stylistic influence. And what really worries me is sometimes I think generative AI um, can result in all of these like similar looking imagery although the designers themselves were actually coming from very like different perspectives or aesthetic styles, and this sort of averaging, I think, is really worrisome. And so like there's real need for thinking about alternative ways of using generative AI.
Mhm.
I, I totally agree. I mean, I think I'll start maybe with my reservation and then move on to the positive. But um, I think for me, there's a spectrum of reflection that happens with design, and I think design is primarily driven by reflection. Like I need the time to sit back and think about something in order to work on it from a design perspective. And I think there's a mode of working with AI that increases the reflection that you can do, right? Where you're seeing new things that you wouldn't otherwise anticipate. You are reacting to new things, and it enables new thought. And I think that's really powerful. But the dangerous part, I think, of working with AI is when you use it to minimize the amount of reflection.
Mhm.
And we see this a lot in large language model ChatGPT exercises where a simple prompt is given and then you get an apology email to a professor from a student, which I unfortunately receive a whole lot of. And that's an instance where reflection is being reduced. And for me, it's just how can we maximize the amount of reflection and thought that we're giving our design? And I'm really, really excited by the potential of working with these tools, but it's just about using them the right way.
Yeah, and I think a little thought to a little time to think about what my big reservations are. I mean, mine are a little more macro. I tend to be more concerned about the sustainability impact of AI, right? Like the amount of worthless prompts that are
Mhm.
generated and the environmental impact from an energy and a water perspective is dramatic. And I think it is something we have to learn to as in prompt engineering and in kind of if you can create endless requests for generation of things, we need to start to think about our impact when we do that. And I think that is something that there are people who are cognizant of. The industry is cognizant of it because of the desire to create more sources of power. But I really do get concerned about the infinite possibility of energy usage that is bound up in these. There's tons of promise, and they're really exciting. We're all here because it's exciting to use. It's exciting for our profession, and we just need to figure out how are we going to control it at the front end so that we're not just doing things because we can do them, but we're actually doing them because they're helpful.
And it feels like, Paul, to your point about enhancing or limiting reflection, it's how do you frame these workflows, when to use it, like any tool, when to use it, why, how, and how do you convey that both to students and to designers in the community and in your studios. But getting a little more practical and granular, in what ways is AI reshaping design workflows today? Could you give any examples, whether you think they're good examples or they are the detriment?
I see a kind of difference in the breadth of work that is produced, because a lot of what happens now, and this is kind of loosely AI, but in computational modeling or in machine learning, it's like there's an ability to produce considerably more than we could previously, right? You can write a script and that can make 1,000 different iterations. And so you're able to evaluate a finished product much more easily. But I think it does shift away the traditional mode, which is you are reflecting on the sort of interstitial stages of the design as you draw it. It's like you draw to see, it's old aphorism. And so there's a kind of shift in the legibility of what's produced and the level of abstraction that people are responding to. Um, yeah, and I think that's not negative or positive. It's just you lose some of the tactility of the design process, I think. But I do think that building a parametric model or something or a computational model probably helps you learn something a little bit better than if you were to just draw it, frankly. But it requires a higher level of skill. And that's why it's something that I feel really strongly about is enabling and empowering people to build their own tools. One thing that's very easy, Lauren, to go back to your point, about large language models, is just to throw ChatGPT, like a huge model, at something that requires a ton of power. And that's not always necessary. You could write a Grasshopper script in 15 minutes sometimes. They could accomplish the same thing and use 0.1% of the amount of power as ChatGPT, and then you learn something from the production. I think we need to enable people to build their own tools so that we don't, outsource that ability to larger corporate models.
Yeah, I mean, one of our fundamental skill sets we build as designers is our own design process. And I think there's this fear that AI will replace your design process, and that's not accurate at all. It's utilized during segments of the spectrum that is your design process. And understand, to Paul's point, like understanding what tool you use, when, and why you use it, that is now, I think, a fundamental part of at least the professional pedagogy is how do you use this? What is your process that you're developing? Where to use it? The 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 potential for AI on the generative side that I've already seen and already used, it gets you, if you use it correctly, it's not um, to use a little bit of example. It's not write me a book and then it writes a book. It's help me with these thoughts, right? I've got these thoughts. Help me create a picture out of that. Something that's lost in that is it goes, I think, as Paul was saying, it goes immediately from the thought to the finished image. And so our traditional process, which exists for a reason, has layers of abstraction built in between the initial thought and the finished image. And now I think the potential is to start to think about how AI can help in that generation, in that iterative phase, as opposed to just skipping. And that to me, because it can, on the image side, on the model side, on a lot of the explorative studies that we do, even the polished result isn't actually polished, right? It just looks polished. And so acknowledging the abstraction that's built in and starting to explore that more in the way we work, I think is the next phase.
Well, I'll give some examples from,
Yeah.
I think they've sort of thoroughly answered the question. So I'll just give pretty specific examples from my own workflows. Because I'm also concerned, as they were saying, about um, like some of the ways that generative AI imagery can limit the way, like the range of possibilities. And so I've been trying to develop some alternative workflows that are very directly involving like the body in terms of the sketching process. And um, part of this is to deal with my own questions about like the authorship or human in the loop or, what kind of workflow we should be having. And so these are meant to be a bit more like craft scale experiments. But one of these projects is using a AR sketching tool, which means I can sketch like at full scale what I have in mind. So using that, but that's sort of live cast or streamcast into a real-time AI tool. So this is trying to subvert the idea of the one-click solution, but instead, like I'm just constantly, continuously in dialogue with the AI tool. And so there's kind of almost like a bodily wrangling with like how much to give influence or not. And so that's an example of like a specific workflow that I was playing around with. And then another workflow is again, because like Paul was saying, like I'm interested in having this like room for reflection. If there's a way to work with AI in a more intermittent way, or non-linear way, so that's a kind of you streamcast again, like your own Rhino platform that a lot of designers are already working and comfortable with. You streamcast that into the AI tool, and it sort of takes time snapshots of your progress. So the idea is then you can reflect back on your prior stages and decide when to remix them. And so these are just sort of like experiments to see, are there alternatives to that one click. workflow.
And are there opportunities in these two examples that you've described, Humbi? Are there opportunities for others to participate in that with you? Is I find it really interesting. Everything we've talked about is very individual and very personal, which you could say is true about any aspect of architecture and design, whether it was 100 years ago and you were sitting alone at your drafting table. But I wonder what the opportunity is for collective engagement and collective participation in this workflow. Is that an option?
Yes, definitely. So actually, the AR sketching tool that was initially meant to be a collaborative project, I ended up executing it alone. But in this AR tool, you can actually both be within the same scene, but not be co-located. So like someone could be on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, draw in the same environment.
Mhm.
Let's say you want to, make an arch together. It doesn't matter where you are, but you can work on this together, stream this. So actually, it would be pretty easy to adapt this for collaborative environment. And then there are also, and like Paul and Lauren, we've talked about this, like sometimes AI can provide an interesting like third party role so that when there's multiple designers, they're ideating, and then generative AI is producing certain kind of imagery, it almost becomes like a neutral third party that you can criticize without feeling like you're offending the other designers' sensibilities. And that can be, I think, pretty interesting and productive. This also then runs into the problem, though, where I think there are studies showing that like humans prefer human outputs than generative AI outputs, and so there can be a layer of additional criticism that maybe is yeah.
It, so I was at Humbi's graduate thesis reviews yesterday at the University of Toronto, and we had a great panel with Brady Peters and Jeannie Kim, and an interesting thread that emerged out of that discussion was this idea of prompting yourself. And I was thinking about it later. One of the real values of the tool is that your students and people broadly using AI are creating things that are prompting them to create something different, right? A little bit like we've been talking about earlier. But for me, it's a really interesting metaphor because my use of AI over a decade or so has changed the way that I think about my own design sensibility, right? It's like I'm keenly aware that I need to prompt it with certain things,
Mhm.
whether it's like student work or the work of my collaborators or precedent or et cetera, to output a new thought. And I know that's kind of a reductive way to think about it in a sense, but um, you need the flow of input to react to things. And I think that, or at least sometimes I do from a design perspective, and that can be like client feedback or any number of different things. Um, but AI is a way to kind of throw you off balance and prompt you in a direction that you might not otherwise. And for me, that's incredibly valuable. Um, but thank you, Humby, for leading that studio because it really got me thinking about the value of this notion of prompting yourself.
Well, I think it's really interesting to think about how we already and how we are trending towards incorporating a collaborative methodology into AI. I think we all use it on the output side. I mean, that's kind of why you do it in a lot of ways. You have your sort of internal, let's call it image or model or tool generation, and everybody's kind of reviewing or analyzing or seeing that, or it's sometimes client side, depending. Um, but it's the earlier stuff that is interesting, right? We now train models, right? We train things, and so thinking about how you train something in a collaborative method, that's the front end, and I think that's the thing that we do it without thinking about it right now, even when we're doing it by ourselves. We're collaborating with perhaps someone else's work or something I did before, which is not me in the present, right? That's a atemporal me, uh, but that is a collaborative mechanism right there, and we do it. And I think as we move forward, and we've started to do this when we start to merge parameterization with AI, that there are some tools that allow you to do this, there's a level of complexity that inherently facilitates collaboration. Right? So in my studio, there's a gentleman and I who I work with pretty closely on this kind of stuff, and it enables you to get the outputs then that you collectively want. So I found that to be interesting. So switching from a dialogue about the output to the dialogue about the input.
Mhm. I've been dealing with the concept of so in collaboration, what uh, what collaboration needs is a kind of a shared something called mental models, right? So kind of mental understanding of the scope of the problem that you're trying to address together, or maybe the range of creative outputs that you're interested in getting. And part of the collaboration process is sort of syncing your mental models together. And there's something interesting when you're using generative AI where um, we're figuring out what the mental model of the tool is, and it's often not quite like the mental model of people we're used to collaborating with. Like there's a lot of just not non-architecture specific disciplinary understanding embedded in it. And so, that has been both productive, like generative in a creative sense, but also quite frustrating sometimes because, well, you're not speaking the same language. And at the same time, it helps you question assumptions that you had already when you were collaborating with, people with similar background as yourselves. I think all of this has been very interesting, very, yeah, productive in conversation.
Well, we are getting a bunch of questions that I do want to get to, but I wanted to just go to one other topic before we start to address the comments and questions from the group. Paul and Humbi, you both teach, as we talked about at the beginning. You work with students every day. How is AI changing the way we prepare this next generation of architects and designers?
I, I think it has pretty radical implications on the way that we are preparing architects because um, I think relatively soon there's going to be a level of automation that we're not really prepared for in terms of traditional tasks that need to be carried out as part of the design process. Like an example that's already happened would be 15, 20 years ago, you needed to know how to draw a stair intimately, right? Your rise and run, etc. And now that knowledge is embedded in a Revit model. Someone else will probably produce a Revit family that includes the rise and run of the stair, and then you just draw the standard. But that sort of thinking and automation, I think, will occur writ large across the process, where you just won't have to intimately know where to place a toilet paper holder, right? Like those sorts of things will become more automated. But what it means is that people are not gaining the knowledge, and I think it puts a new kind of impetus on educators, on teaching maybe the nuts and bolts things that we would presume would happen in practice. Because I just don't think it will. And then, to put on my sort of practice hat and think through from a professional standpoint, it means that we need to think a little bit differently about the degree of automation that we carry forward with. And maybe some things we have to stop and pause and say, okay, this is a moment where we have to teach, even though we're in practice, because if everything is happening automatically, there are no moments for reflection and for teaching on a broader kind of firm-wide level.
Yeah, I want to echo what Paul has been saying about the moment of reflection. I think that is sort of the key thing that I'm concerned with as well. And, AI has been sort of what has been happening is that students are producing so much work, and especially in Toronto, like really excellent, excellent work. But then you're getting deluged. Like you can't have the time really to sit and reflect on what's happening. And one of the ways I'm concerned about AI changing education is it has made it like if the students feel pressure to produce so much that they're kind of putting out like the illusion of knowledge, and AI allows this to happen. But when you sort of like sit and have conversations with them, you realize there are some like fundamental gaps in their understanding of what they've produced because it's sort of co-written by AI. And I think that is a huge pedagogical challenge that we have to contend with. And I don't know whether it's it's a slowing down process, more deliberate about what the deliverables are. And then another point I want to make is about, I think educators have to be very careful about the way AI is used in the beginning, the ideas generation, because of its potential to just sort of like shape the boundaries of the conversation, and whether at some point the students' ideas should come first rather than the AI sort of determining the initial outline. And so in my classes, paradoxically, um, I know we have been going a little bit more pencil and paper, although a lot of my classes are very computational and AI interested. Because, and also I think a lot of the students themselves are sometimes asking or like hungry for a bit more analog experience, even though again, these are students that are self-selected because they're interested in some of these technological questions.
I find that comment you made about the illusion of knowledge really interesting. And you talked about seeing these fundamental gaps. Are you able to characterize them generally, or is it unique for each student and each time you notice it?
Unique for each student. It's kind of like what Paul was saying about the stairs, but
Mhm.
also you can see that in writing sometimes. I think that's sort of the biggest areas I feel concerned about. In some ways, because architecture education requires so many media of outputs, so like physical models, drawings, presentation, narrative, etc. That actually maybe insulates the profession a little bit. But when it's only writing, then it's like a little bit too easy for large language models to be writing all of it. And then so when you then have conversation, you realize, oh, some of the major themes that the writing is saying is not always what the major themes the students are thinking about.
Yeah, I've actually stopped using large language models for writing almost
Yeah.
entirely, but except for very banal things like find me a calendar time that works for these two people. You know what I mean? Like that's the level that I'm working at because I don't often have time to do that, so I can kind of automate it. But for me, writing is thinking, right? It's a method of thinking, and without the writing, I can't really do the thinking in the same way.
See, I think from my perspective, we very rarely start off with AI, like even in writing, for instance, right? Typically, we write something that we want and then we flesh it out. Right? I mean, if you're starting with nothing and going into writing, it's pretty sad, right? In the same way, like with when we're creating ideas, Humbi along the exact same lines. A lot of times we start with a pencil sketch, and it seems like the power of AI is it creates a layer of what's next on the platform that you establish. And so if you have this, if the platform you have is nothing and you give it text, then it gives you something, right? If you give it drawings, the what next is a communicated visual form. And I think that the big question I think that both of you bring up, which is interesting, is like at what point, where do you raise the platform to
Mhm.
before you engage it? So that you have authorship and it isn't just amalgam, right? Because in a way that's kind of what AI does. But it is also the power of it. Instant amalgam. It's amazing.
Well, that's a good segue into the first question we got from our audience, which is beyond just architectural imagery, maybe where we started. How useful or accurate are you finding AI for things like energy modeling? So, something much more perhaps practical.
I can
Well,
I can take this one to
oh, go
start.
ahead. Yeah,
Oh,
why don't you go for
no,
it,
go
Paul?
for it.
Oh, I was just gonna say. So I don't do energy modeling on a daily basis. So I think that I can give tangential examples of how I could see it being useful. I mean, one is think about the AI tools less as something that's fully baked and developed that you then deploy to do an energy study, and more as a tool that you can use to help you create the tool to do energy study. That's where I see it right now. So you could vibe code a plugin to help you do the study you want to do at the level of refinement that is suitable for the level of study you need to do. Now, is there a tool out there that uses AI that you press a button and it does climate analysis? I don't actually know the answer to that question. Maybe Paul was going to answer and say that he's done it 5,000 times.
I was maybe not 5,000, but no, I was going to say that I've had experience with complex simulation being done in aggregate and then being used to train a model that can then infer very quickly. So whereas traditional simulation might take days, to get to a appreciable solution, you can train very quick image to image models, or likewise that will get you a kind of back of the napkin quick calculation, and you can get within 10% accuracy in some cases, or I should say 90% accuracy, to the actual sort of simulated output. And that is obviously not going to get you the level of accuracy needed to complete the building, but it can certainly help you make a better decision at early design stages. And I think that's the real power. Like, this entire conversation so far has been largely focused on generative applications of AI, but I'm actually in many ways more interested in the analytical applications, where going through the design process, it takes a lot to get to a level of resolution that you need to get into energy modeling, et cetera. But if you can get something quick, and you can get a better outcome earlier in the process, I think that's a win for everyone.
And I think it's kind of important to note, like it's there is a desire to AI everything, right? But there are parametric tools right now that do climate analysis. They do it pretty well. They may actually end up being faster than the AI variant that you can create. And so it all depends on what level of resolution you're after, what tools are out there. Not everything is suitable or needs to be considered as an AI application.
Maybe I'll just add one comment. Yeah, you have to be pretty intentional about exactly which tool you're using. Like, don't be using the general purpose AI tools for this.
Well, another question from the audience that is going back to both our early conversation about prompts and right now, Humbi, to yours about which tool is, with so much depending on the prompt, on the input, how do you ensure the quality of that? And what role does critical thinking play in that input, in that engagement?
Humby, you want to take it?
Sure. What role does a prompt take? Well, okay, I'm going to answer it like slightly different angle of this question that I've been wrangling with, which is I think that a lot of the commercially available tools, they start with like the text prompt or image prompt. And like that in itself is pretty constraining because you have to have such a compression of information to craft. So I feel like the way the question is phrased is maybe a little like it could be changed. So for instance, our goal should not be crafting the best text prompt or image prompt, but rather investigating like the larger process. Like again, we were talking about like designing the design process, and I wonder if maybe instead of crafting the right prompt, it's more like crafting like what is actually the end goal here? What's going to be your criteria for evaluating whether you have something successful or not? Those are maybe like the most important things to think about when you're starting out at the prompt stage.
I think that, yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer, because there's the, how do you do a text prompt that gives you the best image with nothing else? Or there's the, what does a prompt actually mean, and what is to Humby's point, like when you start talking about image prompt versus text prompt versus data prompt, ultimately the best prompts have the most appropriate elements in a chain, right? So you have a style, uh, you have a reference, um, you have qualities, and those might be coming from very different. And I'm purely talking like how you'd create a nice image right now, right? But it's you give it many things. The more things you give, the more appropriate your result is, because otherwise it's kind of like a shotgun approach, right? Like you're going to aim in that direction and boom, and it's going to be, you know, 40 degrees off of what you wanted. But is that really worth the time you've done, or should you give more to it? And that's why I think all of us are talking a little bit about how much, if you think about a sketch as an input, is a prompt. I mean, on some level, right? It's how much control do you take at the front end, because that really is the perfect prompt, is the most controlled, most accurate input to get a series of outputs that are in a range that either are usable or expected, right? What you don't want is unexpected and unusable.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of discussion about prompting, but the critical thinking, I think, is maybe more important than the prompt. To answer the initial question, where people talk about world models and large language models having like an understanding of the world, which is true to a certain extent, but it's the world as described by the internet that the large language model was trained on by scraping. And what it does not have an understanding of is your own brain. And the only way, that you can provide the sort of input required to align the output of the large language model with your intended output is through the critical thinking and through by applying your own criticality. Like you need that piece. If it's only prompting, I don't think you get the other half of the equation.
Well, we talked a little about the impact that AI is having specifically in architectural education. Thinking more about professional practice, how can the profession ensure that AI tools are used responsibly and don't disadvantage emerging talent or specialized skills? And maybe, Paul, I'll ask you to start because I know this is an area of real special interest.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I think that AI might have a leveling effect, really, on the emerging talent relative to existing talent, because oftentimes people that are more a bit more situated, right, in practice, have access to things like renderings or people that can produce diagrams, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just the result of how practices work. But if a single person can produce the sort of amount of representation required to run a client meeting, for instance, I think it changes the dynamic a little bit in a positive way. I think that I feel really strongly about best idea wins, charrette style design studio. And I really strongly encourage everyone in our studio to put ideas forward, because that's how you get the best outcome. And I'm excited by that kind of leveling effect, the floating tide rising all boats, where you don't need a full-fledged design studio to come up with a great idea or a great presentation or a great building, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean that, and I'll kind of
Anybody?
piggyback on the back of that. Also, as a professional practitioner, um, I think there is a concern about it disadvantaging earlier career design folks, and I think what we have seen thus far is that it actually is unwarranted on some level, because it is a tool that people use. And so I think that, how are we using it in a way that doesn't disadvantage them? I mean, honestly, right now, so much of it requires a higher level of thing. I mean, yes, the creating an image with a simple text prompt, anybody can do that, right? So I can do that. Anybody can. But where the future is with AI, and you really want to harness its potential, it takes a level of complexity and understanding, and the the pipeline coming out of our graduate school programs. giving an aptitude to think beyond just a text prompt and give me an image is essential to the next generation. And really, it already has been through every other toolkit we've embraced as a practice, um, and as a profession. So people coming through now earlier in their careers, they're more likely to be able to parameterize things, for instance. They're more likely to be able to understand how to do something that isn't right at hand but requires a series of steps, process-based design. And the future of AI, as we've been talking about, that platformed prompt, whatever you want to call it, the basis that is a designer's input and intuition and desire, that still needs to be established. And now I think it actually empowers those earlier in their career because you have the ability to engage with ultimately training the model that everybody is going to use. Whereas before, if you think of way back, it's the design lead with a pencil and a napkin and do this, right? And there was this sort of level of, "Oh, okay, like I'll try and interpret it." But now that power is actually more in the hands of somebody who's more junior in their career, which is an interesting sort of flip that's happening. So yes, now I have the power to say, hey, I want to see some images with this simple prompt in my little sketch. But at the same time, someone so much earlier in their career is able to establish the model by which the entire team is going to understand design progression throughout the life of the project. And that's unique.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that maybe one way um, it can cause disadvantages to emerging talent is that there's sometimes just like shared visual language or sensibility that is established through um, your social circle, your schooling, etc. And sometimes generative AI, because it's essentially outputting like statistical averaging, it can produce imagery or sketches that are loaded with some of these stereotypes, which need a lot of like practice and education and critical thinking to, identify which of these elements of the imagery are kind of stereotypes of certain, or very much very like Dezeen or certain kind of architectural magazines, that the kind of imagery that's online, or maybe even like deviant art kind of visualizations. And they're not so much like the architectural language or visual imagery that the firms are interested in. I can see that sometimes emerging talents can't identify that as quickly, and the more established firm people will feel sort of like, oh, we're not speaking the same visual language. And I think that before generative AI imagery, maybe the firms could have been more willing to just take on the person and um, embrace them under like teach them the firm's visual language. But yeah, I can see this sometimes being a hurdle at the applications level.
Well, there's apparently a whole conversation that's happening in the comments, which is great. And some of it is getting very tactical about which particular tools or platforms you use. And so, what I might ask is if the three of you, after the fact, if you have a minute, could go in, because you all have your own favorites and ideas, but maybe we can conclude with some other questions that have been coming up, which is kind of how much AI is too much AI? And how do you figure out, like, how do you strike this balance between human thinking, creativity, and engagement with this tool entity?
If
I do
everything you
think a
do
lot
starts to look like melted cheese, you're screwed.
I think a lot of AI companies, like there is a lot of hype language kind of creating this idea that you can solve everything through AI. And I think that as a discipline, we have been maturing beyond that. Like that's not the expectation anymore, thankfully. Um, and that personally, for my own research, I'm very much advocating for very like slow paced critical thinking, very intentional spot uses of AI. And I think at the moment, that's the direction that I would encourage for other people as well. Like when you start to daisy chain so many AI models together to just speed up all the processes, then it just sort of becomes it's not creative or it's not your work anymore.
Yeah. You said something really important at the outset of this call, which is that humans are interested in what other humans do. Like it's why people read literature and not just like genre fiction, right? It's because you're interested in the shared experience and the overlap between like your own understanding and what the author is saying, right? And I think that the same works. It works the same way in architecture. Is like we like to read into form as architects. Like I like to understand the ambitions of the architect and read through the design through this like close reading process. And if a building is AI generated, it's a whole lot less interesting to me because it lacks the intention. There is no intention, literally. It's like the stochastic parrot, Emily Bender. It's just the output of a statistical process and not the output of a set of intentions. And for me, it loses the interest. And I think that a lot of people feel the same way.
Yeah, I think my melted G's comment is because it's the sort of generalized hallucination of every AI visualization I've ever seen. People forget we're people that design for people. We design for the human experience. And I think that it's easy to forget that that's not what AI does. AI is there to do certain things. It's a toolkit. But at the end of the day, we are the arbiters of whether or not that toolkit serves to improve the human experience. And if your design process does not evaluate at its core level how what you're doing is going to be perceived through time and space and physicality, then it's going to be a failure. It is, and I think that is something that is at risk in a purely AI pipeline because it is amalgam of amalgam upon an amalgam, right? You can't design through aggregation. You have to design through intentionality, and that's why AI can be powerful if given the right intentionality to work with. We, as a profession, we're going to have to just watch it. I mean, we're going to see, and we I have to say I haven't actually experienced in the profession a whole lot of purely AI workflow stuff that's generating garbage, right? Because I think that most of the people in the profession, it's still relatively new, and so most people are establishing some level of design before incorporating AI beyond a visioning level of thing. So I guess maybe I'm not quite as concerned because I think people at their core still want to be thinking, still want to be iterating, still want to have control over their world so that we're not just automatons.
That feels like a great place to end. On a maybe more optimistic note than where we were at parts of the beginning. Uh, so I want to thank all three of you for the conversation. Thank everyone who joined us. And please keep comments and questions going. And to the extent that folks are able to, Loren, Paul, and Humbi will go in and respond to them. If you don't follow them on LinkedIn already, please do, and you can keep the conversation going. And thanks, everybody. This has been great.